We're excited to talk today about how to write these effective and memorable slide taglines. Jenny Ray, would you like to jump in, say hey, and maybe just remind folks about the pyramidal structure that we've been talking about over the last few months and just anchor us again on what that looks like?
You bet. I wrote down a question. What taglines are effective but not memorable? And what taglines are memorable but not effective? Because actually what we're talking about are slides that are neither. But I think it will help us clarify what an effective but not memorable slide tagline is and what a memorable but not effective one are. So let me just highlight that from my perspective for a second. Namaan, you can weigh back in, and then I'll dive into the recap. But something that's memorable but not effective is something that is what I would consider to be the word that I'm thinking of is inflammatory, right? But it basically like drops a bomb that isn't a part of a bigger story. So it kind of like that could have to do with where the slide fits in the presentation, but it really basically, as you're introducing a slide, it says something like, this division is terrible, right? And something that people didn't have a pre-read on, wasn't kind of historically understood. It will potentially fit the characteristics of what we talk about with how long a slide tagline should be and the kind of directional focus it is, but it's memorable in the wrong way. And then there are other slide taglines that are effective, but not memorable. What I mean by that is that they tell you what the slide is about to tell you, but they don't tell you the story. And so when we get into what we're going to talk about a little bit later, we're going to give you some rules for taglines. And those rules are good starting guidelines. But the thing that I just want to make sure that we know today is that there are terrible taglines, right? And we're going to talk really clearly about what those are. But the difference between good and great is really what highlights these. So Namaan, do you have anything else to add about effective but not memorable, or memorable but not effective?
Well,
because I thought that was a great lead-in. We talked about it early.
So I was going to say my general bias is towards being memorable. And so I have to push myself towards being effective and memorable. And so taking that shock and awe approach that says, here's everything that's wrong. Let me just slap you in the face with something I know you're going to disagree with right up front is incredibly memorable and turns the audience off right away. And so to me, the biggest distinguishing mark of something that's effective and memorable is, number one, it includes some kind of insight. What am I supposed to do or take away from this slide? And then number two, it connects to what came before it and it connects to what comes after it. And I think that's really what Jenny Ray's talking about when she's talking about storytelling, is that insight does not exist within a vacuum. It's connected to the rest of the story. And if we can really live at the intersection of story and data, I think we're going to find ourselves being effective and memorable.
So now you can go on to the other piece, but I just wanted to highlight that because, as Namaan said, it's really, we've been teaching for a number of months now, just one-off pieces of how to do this, a piece of a story, a part of an effective tagline, how you build a great executive summary. But really, effective communication begins with an assertion followed by a story that's curated for the audience. And what we find is a lot of people don't have an assertion. Like, it actually doesn't exist. You ask them point blank, what do you want the audience to do at the end of this? And they'll tell you after a little bit of thought, and it exists nowhere in the presentation. It's not written down. It's not voiced over. The presentation doesn't speak to it ever. That's the most common issue that we see, is no assertion. But when people have an assertion, we see major breakdowns in the story that they tell. And so when we are building from the ground up what a great presentation will have, the first thing that it starts with is one slide, situation, complication, and question, what we call the SCQ slide, which really highlights, here's where we are, here's the problem that we're having, and this is the issue that we're going to be addressing today in the conversation. The assertion is the answer to that issue that the presenter has come up with on their own. They're not guiding other people through it to a consensus. They are making the assertion that they, because they're closer to the information and have spent more time in the data and the details, have an insight or an answer that other people don't have, and they're communicating it clearly. And the remainder of the story are the arguments why that assertion is right. Like, here are the things that I looked at, and this is what I found. And then here's the specific data that speaks to that point. And so when any part of this is missing, you'll have an assertion without a story, or a story without an assertion.
One very brief thing I just want to add to that is one of the mistakes that I see a lot of people make in the presentation coaching that I do is they tell the same story over and over and over again. Once they figure out that they need to tell a story, they tell the same story over and over again to different stakeholders at different points in time. And the real crux of using this approach is that you tell a curated story every single time. So the assertion that you're identifying, the supporting rationale that you're bringing to the table are really, really focused on who is my audience and at what time am I speaking to them? And so what do they need to hear from me right now? And what are the top reasons why they will believe my assertion right now? And so I just wanted to call that out as well, because it's very easy to fall in love with the framework and say, hey, I've got a story. But the real power of this is when you apply it over and over and over again to tell a little bit of a different and more curated story each time.
Now, we're not talking about, necessarily abandoning data in any way, shape, or form. Namaan and I are incredibly data-driven people. I got 6 emails from Namaan yesterday that asked for data from different people on our team that didn't communicate them. And so we're not anti-data. We're not looking for story without data. In fact, we're looking for data to be the foundation of everything we do. The problem is, if you start with the data, you often never make your way to the assertion. And we've seen this over and over again when we are coaching people through our case competition process. So Namaan just did one last week. We've done a number of them this fall. We do this a lot with business schools. And we will come in and we teach, and then we actually guide people through a case competition. And the teams that succeed are usually the ones who come to their assertion more quickly. The teams that don't succeed have a tremendous amount of data, rigorous data, thoughtful data, scattered data, right, comprehensive data. But they start with the data and never make their way in the time frame to the assertion. And we see this over and over again, that the teams that we've coached become successful in other case competitions because they're really good at driving to that assertion. The assertion does limit you. It doesn't always get you to the 100% right answer every time, but it does get you to an answer, and you still have to prove it. There isn't any room to create an assertion that you fake the data for. And so if you create an assertion and the data doesn't prove it, the worst case scenario is that now you looked at focused data that leads you directly to an alternate assertion. And that alternate assertion becomes the focus of what you do. So instead of starting with data, and taking 3 PhD years to come up with an answer, you can take an hour to decide on the assertion, develop the arguments, and identify the data. And the purpose of the pyramid principle is not the standard purpose, which is to prove a point to the point of I am the only expert in the world on it. The point is I'm a better expert than you because I'm closer to the data. I looked at the data. This is what the data says. But instead of letting the data tell you, you tell the data what you're looking for and then see if it says that or not.
The best story beats the best answer every single time.
Every single time.
That's just the reality of how our world works. And so pyramid principle allows you to actually get to a better answer because you're taking that hypothesis-driven approach and tell a clearer, more effective story. And so you check both boxes and you're able to gain that buy-in and motivate action much more often.
But an automatic fail is somebody who doesn't tell a credible story, right? So again, I just really want to highlight here, the biggest pushback we always get for this is, well, what if the assertion leads you to a conclusion that's false? It can't. You don't fabricate the data. That's not the point of what you're doing here. And so if somebody makes a calculation error or makes an assertion that doesn't prove out, they have to pivot. They'll do that every time. But when somebody tells a compelling story about an assertion that is founded in arguments and reasoned in data, that will beat an overflow of data 100% of the time.
Here's an example, and we showed this last month as well, just as a representative example of what a top-down story can look like. And today we're actually really going to dive into the bottom layer of this story and practice writing mini assertions for each slide. So if you look at the story from top to bottom, the question that we're asking today is, how can we increase our profit by 10%? And the assertion that we're bringing to the table is we can do that And we can actually reduce costs by $500 million through implementing 3 operational improvements. How can we do that? What's the rationale behind that? Well, first, we can outsource our non-core business processes. We believe that will get us $200 million of the way there. Controversial way to start a story, absolutely. Second, we can simplify our core business processes, and that'll get us that next $200 million of the way there. And finally, we can consolidate our non-core suppliers. That will get us that final $100 million that will get us to the $500 million total cost savings. Now, let me walk you through the story. And then I would have 3 slides in this example for each story proving why and how we should outsource non-core business processes. And my goal by the end of those 3 slides is that you believe, A, that we should outsource those processes, and 2, that we have a viable way to do it. And then my goal for chapter 2 is that after that second chapter, you believe that we can simplify core business processes and that I've identified the right ones for us to simplify, and that we'll achieve that $200 million cost savings. I'm asserting that we will. The same is true for chapter 3. And so if you believe each chapter individually, then my thinking is that you will then believe my assertion as a result. So if you believe that chapter 1 is true, that chapter 2 is true, that chapter 3 is true, then you will then believe that my overall assertion is true, and we can talk about next steps from there. So one of the things that we talked about last time was building the entire story before you ever build a slide. And we spend generally, the big we probably spend 95% of our time building slides. We put 100 slides together, we throw them all up against the wall, and we see what sticks. And we spend 5% of our time thinking about the story, when in reality, that formula should be flipped. And so taking this approach, putting a storyboard together first, allows you to do the more strategic work of thinking through, what is it that I'm really trying to assert? Why would my audience say yes or no to it? And put the story together first. Once you do that, relatively speaking, the slide building becomes really, really easy. And that's the part that you can then outsource, because you've already identified, here's what the story is, here's the data that I want to go source to back that story up, and somebody else on the team can go do it. So this is the overall pyramid approach and what a full top-down story looks like. Let's talk through the process to get there. And we've previewed this a little bit, but there's a 5-step process that you should take to build pyramid principle presentations. And what we're really going to hone in on today is step 4, because if you've joined us for previous sessions, we've already talked about how to define an assertion. We've already talked about building an executive summary. We've already talked about what it looks like to order our story strategically based on who our stakeholders are and what their potential objections to our story would be. So the next step now is to talk about, what does the messaging on each individual slide look like? And so first, we defined an assertion. Second, we turned that assertion into an executive summary that includes what it is that we want our stakeholders to do, and then why we want them to do or believe that thing at this point in time. We identified the objections of our stakeholders. Why do we think we'd say no? They would say no to our recommendation. And how can we craft a story to address the reasons that we think that they're going to have to not doing what we're asking them to do? And we incorporate that perspective into our story. This is something that we've talked about over the last couple of sessions. We then take that executive summary, our assertion, what is it that I want you to do, our arguments, what's the supporting rationale for that assertion, and we place them into a storyboard. And this allows us then to think about the third layer of our story, which is, what is each individual slide inside of each chapter going to say? How am I going to tell the story of chapter 1? What's the order going to be? What's the key message on each slide going to be? How am I going to connect them one after the other, so that by the end of that 3 to 5 slide section, you believe that chapter 1 is true? And so the first step to identifying what each slide is going to say is actually to write the title. So we write the title before we build the slide. And it's just as Jenny Ray was talking about, we identify an assertion before we go and build the executive summary and build the story. We write a draft title first. This allows us then to go and see if the data supports what the key takeaway is. And if the data doesn't support what the key takeaway is, great, I come back and I tweak my title. But identifying the key takeaway first focuses my analysis and tells me where I have to go and what I have to find to prove or disprove the story. So there are 4 types of slide titles or taglines that we've identified at Management Consulted. The first is level 0. It's a description level tagline. It's really a chart title is what it is. And 0% of the time should you be at level 0. But I see a lot of slides that show me 2022 cost by division. And I'm looking at the slide, and here's what happens. The first question that I'm asking in my head is, so what? Why am I looking at this? What does this have to do with the broader story? What am I supposed to take away from this? And if your audience is asking the so what question on any particular slide, you are in danger of losing them right at the beginning. So first, you don't want me to be asking that question, so what? Second, you don't actually want me to be doing a deep dive into your data visualization, because what's going to happen, I'm going to be drawn to a different part of the data than you want me to see. I'm going to be trying to do math on the slide when you don't want me doing math, trust me. And what's going to happen is you are going to be presenting the slide. And while you're talking, I'm ignoring you because I'm actually trying to look at the slide myself and figure out what's the key takeaway here. And we end up misaligned after your presentation of the slide instead of aligned, because I've been trying to figure out what the key takeaway is myself instead of just reading the title and then listening to what you have to say to me. So we don't want to be at level 0. We also don't want to be at level 1. Level 1's just a summary. So in this basic example, right, 2022 costs increased by 22%. Great, so what? I don't have enough context yet to know if that's a meaningful title or not. What I really want is an insight. Why did our costs increase, for example? And so an insight, a level 2 tagline could look like changes in supplier fees drove our cost to increase in 2022 by 22%. Okay, great. Now I'm starting to get a sense of why you're showing me this slide. You've identified the biggest driver to the cost increase. And you've got data to prove it to me, but I don't actually even have to look at the slide to see that the biggest driver is the changes in our supplier fees. So at minimum, whenever I'm coaching teams and executives on presentations, I push them to, at minimum, be at a level 2 slide tagline. What is the insight from the slide? If there's one thing that you'd want me to understand from the data, what is it? That belongs in the title. And that becomes the assertion of the slide. It's the key message of that slide. And sometimes we're even able to take it a step further and drive potential action from a slide. And that's level 3. And level 3 tells me renegotiate with these 21 suppliers to save 16% on our costs in the next year. Sometimes I don't have an action to drive from a slide, but I always have an insight that I can show. If I don't have an insight, there's no reason for me to be presenting that slide. But often—
That's the hardest thing, Namaan. Wait, say that again for the people in the back. Say that again for the people in the back, because y'all all fall in love with your slides and you want to keep them and you want to never cut them. And these are, you just have 2 choices. We make it super simple. Say it one more time.
If you don't have an insight for me, then there's no reason for me to see the slide. And one of the things that's really helped folks that I've worked with in the past, just to start getting comfortable with cutting slides, is actually incorporating a structured appendix inside of their presentations. Because all the slides that you love but don't really have a lot of meaning behind them, you can put in the appendix. And so they can act as a crutch for you. And you're like, you know what, if I, for whatever reason, end up needing that slide or end up needing to reference that data, it's still there, but it's not meaningful enough for me, or it's not meaningful enough to belong in the main narrative portion of my story. And so for those of you that feel really uncomfortable with cutting slides or not presenting everything that you could present, I found a structured appendix is a really, really helpful way to start moving you away from presenting everything and towards presenting the most important things. And you still have access to everything that you think you might want. And I found that when I do that, 99.9% of the time, I never have to dip into my appendix because my story is so much clearer. My insights have been elevated to the top of each slide. I don't get the questions I think I'm going to get about the data because I'm presenting myself as an advisor as an expert on what I'm talking about. And very rarely do people want to do a deeper dive into the Excel model or into all the data to take a look at it in the meeting. There's always that one person sometimes who wants to, and that's what the appendix is there for. But 99 times out of 100, it ends up going unused. And so the more experience that you have putting these types of stories together with an appendix, I think you'll find that the less that data without insight is really necessary. and you'll get more comfortable moving away from even building those slides to begin with. So just to recap and summarize, at minimum, we're going to be at level 2. Give me an insight from the slide. And if possible, we're going to try and drive action from the slide. What is the implication of the data that you're showing me? What should I do as a result of it? The way that we communicate these taglines, these titles, is in full sentences. So I want you to write a full sentence slide title for each slide that you're presenting. And the goal is that you identify an initial key message for each slide in your presentation before you build the slide. And we'll share our storyboard template with you after this call. And it looks something like what's on the slide. My goal would be for you to start writing full sentences for each slide in each chapter. Okay, if chapter 1 is that assertions make your recommendation and purpose clear, what would I want the first slide of that first chapter to say? What would I want the second slide to say? What would I want the third slide to say? How does slide 2 and slide 3 build on slide 1? And I would start to identify what those key takeaways are, what the data is that I want to represent inside the chapters of my story. And one thing that I've actually found helpful is just to take out a pen and paper and write paragraphs and just start writing my story out in written form. Each sentence of my paragraph becomes the title of each slide. And I can then transpose the paragraph that I've written into the storyboard template. That helps me just get a 30,000 foot view and flow of the entire story from top to bottom. And I come from a background where I've done a lot of writing, so that's helpful for me. It's just to literally take out a pen and paper or take out a Word doc and start writing. And I then know that each full sentence is a key message and belongs on one slide. So I then put those sentences, those slide titles, inside of a storyboard template like this. And my goal, one of my filters, is to just read the titles from top to bottom and see if the story flows. If the story doesn't flow, if it doesn't read like a logical, complete narrative, then one of two things is true. Either one of my titles is off, or I've got the wrong key takeaway for that slide. And so one of the filters that I utilize for ensuring that my story is actually complete is just reading the slide titles. And if I can read sentence after sentence after sentence after sentence, and the story makes sense, and I can understand what it is that you want me to do coming out of that presentation, then that's one of my signs that I'm done. But one of the things that I've found just in years of doing this is that when we leave decks and presentations behind for people to review without the benefit of our voiceover, what they end up doing is just reading the titles, and they don't bother to look at the content of the slide. And if they cannot just flip through and read the titles and understand what it is that we want them to do, we've lost them. What's the point of the leave behind? All you're doing is asking for another meeting that you could have avoided. All you're doing is introducing confusion when you could have actually introduced clarity and aligned people around the next steps that you're looking for them to take. And so this is incredibly helpful before you build a presentation because it helps you plan what the story is going to be. It's incredibly helpful in the meeting because it helps you and your audience identify what the clear takeaway is for that particular slide. And it's incredibly helpful after the meeting because when you leave the deck, people can flip through without the benefit of the additional context and still understand what the story is. I'll pause here. January, anything you want to add to that?
No, I mean, I just think that when Namaan's talking about the taglines, one of the things that we're going to give you some rules, like we mentioned in a minute. We're giving you the theory first. We'll talk about application at the end. But usually taglines are one of those things that people don't know are broken. I think I just want to add that on as a layer of what Namaan's talking about. Like, you think they're probably fine. They don't feel like the most urgent issue inside here. But just going back to my time when I was at Bain, when I started, I was at that level 0 kind of tagline. That was the kind, when they asked me, how good are you at presentations? I was like, I'm not an 8 out of 10, and this was me. I was like level 0 because Well, the only thing I thought would be really bad is if you didn't have a tagline at all. I didn't know that there were, bad, good, and great taglines. And so I think just pay attention to the audience engagement of whether or not they feel like they have a question to ask on every slide. If they don't, if there's no question for them to ask, nothing for them to engage with, no conversation to have, then the action is probably not evident to them. And that's something that I learned in my first, project when I was at Bain. I was like, oh, here's some numbers. They were like, no, we don't need numbers. Like, what should the client do? Right. So we were constantly really thinking about that, because if we were telling the client what to do, then we had two options afterwards. The client would do it or not. They would choose to do it. And then they would choose who to do it. And sometimes in consulting, that was the way that you had a 4-year project, was that you identified that something needed to be done. The client agreed that it needed to be done, but nobody on the client wanted to do it. And so they hired you again to do it over and over again. And so if you want to become not just a great presenter, but actually invaluable inside your organization, i.e., something must be done, you've gotten them to that point. Now the question is, who should do it? It's probably, congratulations, going to be you. This is like the one pathway to job security that I never recognized, right? Because you're not an information guru. This is something where where you are communicating that you understand the business, that you're highlighting the data, and that you're communicating the action. And when you can do all of those things together, you really are able to create transformation inside your organizations.
I think, January, what you're really talking about is a mindset shift and moving away from trying to prove to people that I know everything and that I'm right and that I have all the data at my disposal, to moving towards a place of confidence and being an advisor and saying, I don't have to show you everything that I know. I don't have to show you all the work that I did. And I think that's one of the temptations that young consultants fall into, right? Is look at all the work that I did, because it was a crap ton of work.
I spent 80 hours on this, and they'd be like, yeah.
but maybe only right, the insight came from 10% of the work, and it feels really wrong to me that I'm only sharing 10% of what I did. But the client or the stakeholder, whether they're internal or external, doesn't care how much work I did. They care about what it means for them. And so I don't need to prove that I did a lot of work. I need to prove that what I did is meaningful to you. And there's really only probably 20% of what I looked at that's going to drive 80% of the impact or the decision making for whoever the stakeholder group is. And so moving away from communicating everything to communicating the most important things, I think, is more of a mindset shift than even a skill. And that's what we're talking about today.
100%. It is really, really sad to do 80 hours of work and have somewhere between 0 and 5% of it matter. But that's part of the professional development process you have to embrace in order to become really good at your work. You will get it right 5% of the time. You celebrate the 5%, you start cutting out the 95% that you did that you don't actually need going forward. And the more that you use this process, the more that you tell the story that they need to know, the less time you spend that doesn't actually align with the action that needs to be taken inside the organization. Transforms everything.
So you worked 80 hours a week your first year at Bain. How many hours a week did you work your second year?
So we didn't have to report hours for billables because we were on a flat rate billing with the client. And Bain, that was one of the things that they told us at the beginning, like, we will incentivize you to work less and get more done. And they said McKinsey will not necessarily do that, but that's going to be one of the hallmarks of your time here. So I had between 20 and 40 hour weeks. My average was 30. My 40 hour weeks were the weeks before a presentation. So, I mean, sometimes it would get even a little crazy. New junior people, maybe 60 people, maybe 60 hours, but it was like golf, long lunches, lots of dry cleaning in the first couple of weeks of a project, because all I was doing was writing taglines and developing a research plan. Like I didn't have to go look at mountains of data anymore, because I knew much more clearly what we had to present at the end. And so I was able to just figure out what the gaps were going to be and fill in those gaps. And I was much more razor sharp about my work.
So this is a whole nother talk show, but I think that speaks to the power of building an analytical plan based on the slides that you have to present at the end, and not based on the data that you think you want to go find. And we can talk more about that at the end, but I think that's going to cut the time that you need to put a full story together by 90% plus. and that's typically what we see when we work with our partners and teams inside of these organizations, is it takes a little bit of time up front to internalize this process. It maybe takes you initially 10 hours longer to create a story or a presentation, but you save 1,000 hours in the back end when you replicate this across, engagement by engagement by engagement, story by story by story. I'm not able to see the chat, but I'm seeing that there's some things coming through. So Jenny Ray, if there's anything you'd like to speak to from the chat, I'll give you the floor.
Honestly, just a combination of praise for you and disbelief about what we're saying. So, but nothing we have to address on the floor. You can keep going, Namaan. I think we want to see this in action.
Let's do it. So let me give you a couple of rules. People love rules, and so
rules are good. Yeah, rules are good.
Rules are good. They're good guidelines. And you have to know what the rules are first so that you can stick to them, and second, so you can break them. So let's first talk about how we can stick to them. So one slide equals one key message. One of the big issues I see with the presentations that I am reviewing and coaching folks on as I do this year round is that their slides are incredibly dense. And again, the mindset behind that is the more I communicate, the more persuasive I must be. And the truth really is the less you communicate, the more persuasive you are. Just very, very quickly, think about, going to McDonald's versus going to a nice restaurant. A nice restaurant asks you to spend 50 or 100 times more money than McDonald's does, and yet the menu is 10% of the size. There is not a connection between more information and more persuasion, or there's not a connection necessarily between sharing more information and driving higher value decisions. What stakeholders are looking for from us is more clarity, not more information. And so often the way that we communicate more clarity is by focusing them on what matters the most. And so each slide is going to communicate one major theme or idea. That's it. If you've got two things that you want to communicate in a chapter, that's two different slides. But one slide equals one takeaway. Second, each title is going to be a complete sentence that is a maximum of 2 lines long. And please don't fudge with your organization's template to get your title to 2 lines. Whatever the font is, whatever the sizing is, stick to that, but keep your sentence to 2 lines maximum. Third, make sure that whatever the key message is from that slide is focused on that so what that I mentioned earlier. When your audience, when your stakeholders are looking at the slide, do they understand what the implications are of that slide for them? Do they understand what am I supposed to do because you shared this information with me? How does this change what I believe? How does this get me to buy into the overall assertion that you made at the beginning of our meeting together? And if this slide is not in service of the larger assertion, then it probably doesn't belong in the story. It might be great data, it might be really insightful, but if it doesn't move me closer to aligning with you on your key message, it's probably a waste of time. And then finally, use active language inside of your title. So look to start your taglines as much as possible with an action verb. So cut out the filler language as much as you can. Look to include a metric if you can inside of the title. Again, if you're showing me a data visualization that might require me to do some math, then do the math for me and tell me what the actual number is inside the slide title. So don't show me, for example, Slovakia market size 2022 in the slide title. Tell me the total opportunity in Slovakia is 500 billion euro in 2022. Actually do that type of math for me and include that number in the slide title if you can. And then if possible, try to give me the why behind the insight as well, inside the title. So what is it that I'm supposed to do or believe off this slide? And then why is that important for me? That's the second half of the title. So let me just review that quickly. Start with an action verb, try and include a metric if you can. Try and write your slide title so that they include both a what and a why component. Make sure they're full sentences. and make sure that there's only one key takeaway that you're highlighting inside of that title. And once you've done that, your storyboard will start to look something like this. So I would have identified my main assertion for the story already. I would have identified what my supporting pieces of rationale are for that story. And then I would have filled in this middle gray column with what I think the key message is going to be on each slide. And that then informs the data that I go and find to actually put on the slide. Let's apply this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through 3 slides here that are legacy McKinsey slides. Full disclosure, I don't love the slides. So ignore the design, but they're older McKinsey slides, and I'm going to walk you through and tell you a mini story. And then we're going to go back to the beginning, and we're going to write a tagline for each slide. Because often what happens is that we end up presenting slides that we created long ago, or we end up presenting slides that others created for us and that we are told we are not allowed to change. And so one of the quickest ways that we can start to incorporate pyramid principle into our presentations is by just even adjusting the slide titles without touching the rest of the slide. And so that's one of your next steps coming out of today is, can you go back to legacy decks that you use over and over and over again and just adjust the title and see how much clearer that makes your story without even adjusting the content on the slides. So here's the assertion for this presentation. Our client is a large insurance company that we are recommending should enter the Polish market. Okay, so our assertion is that they should go to Poland. Here's the first slide. On this slide, what you're seeing is the insurance penetration rate for Poland as a percentage of GDP versus the insurance penetration rate for the EU3 as a percentage of GDP. And the EU3 in this example are France, Germany, and the UK. This is pre-Brexit. There are 2 components that make up insurance penetration inside of any market: life insurance and non-life insurance. And so when you add up life and non-life, you get that total number at the top. And then there are different segments to non-life insurance or subsegments. You've got motor insurance, property insurance, health insurance, other property and casualty insurance. When you roll all of those up, you get to that total non-life number. So that's what this slide is showing. No idea what the thumbs up is for. but that's the data on this slide. After this, the story goes to talk to us about 5 trends that are taking place in the Polish insurance market right now. And you can see the 5 trends here on the slide. And then third, we double click into one of those trends, which is the aging population in Poland. And you can see that by 2030, McKinsey's projecting that 23% of the Polish population will be 65 or over. So you've got insurance penetration in Poland. You've got trends playing out in the Polish landscape in the market. And then you've got to double click into one of those trends that shows the aging population. We're going to go back to this first slide. And I'm going to put here 90 seconds on the clock and ask you to draft a tagline for this slide in the chat. Don't hit enter until the timer goes off, but take 90 seconds to think through what's the insight or the assertion that's coming from this slide. Understanding that I have to connect it to the slides that are to come. So 90 seconds on the clock. And then Jenny Ray, I'll ask you to maybe pick out 1 or 2 taglines that you like from the examples and share some feedback.
Love it. Happy to do that.
All right. Time flies when you're having fun. That was 90 seconds. So go ahead and hit enter.
Okay, amazing. So I'm just going to, Namaan, can you actually go back to the slide that has the 4 levels? There you go. So I just want to kind of read these out and call out what level they are, right? So life and non-life factors are the primary, life and non-life are the primary factors in insurance penetration, GWP and GDP percentage for Poland and the EU. So that I would consider to be a summary, a level 1 tagline. so Aaron, right direction, but there isn't necessarily any it's kind of maybe a blend between summary and insight, but it's definitely not an assertion. It doesn't have the action in it. Tasheka, I like yours. It has enter the Polish market because it's growing, has the assertion portion on it. I think it could think of a little bit more to say, right? Something about like the total growth or where it's growing, or enter the Polish market specifically where, because it's a growing category. I think that could make it a little bit better, but you are in the assertion category. Threefold untapped insurance penetration is possible in Poland market. Ankur, that's definitely a summary, a level 1. So think about how you could really tie that into the insight or into the assertion. Marcia, you put the opportunity in Poland. That's a great example of a level 0, a description, right? The opportunity in Poland instead of a kind of overall key piece. Namaan, I feel like yours is going to be good, except I'm pretty sure you broke the 10-word rule. Pretty sure. Did you count?
I broke the 10-word rule, but I'm going to say that's going to fit on 2 lines.
I don't know. We're gonna have to regulate the regulator here, potentially.
Yeah.
So, right, Polish market represents XX total opportunity, and insurance penetration rates are only 33% of the EU. I think like Namaan, you could probably pick one, right? Polish market represents whatever the total opportunity is. You can't actually necessarily calculate that from here. So what he's highlighting is that what he wants to say is something that the slide doesn't necessarily say, but insurance penetration rates are only 33% of the EU. That does the math for me. I really like that part of it. So that's probably where I would start. And maybe something like enter Poland, because insurance penetration rates are only 33% of the EU. Again, we may not be exactly in that part of the presentation, but that might help just highlight it. So this is something that's the same exercise you can do. You can use that slide that we sent. Maybe we can actually even send that slide as a follow-on for everybody who registered for the call today, the 4 levels of slides, so that you can use that as a barometer to check your slides against. Do we have time for one more, Namaan?
Yeah, let's do one more. I think there's actually important data that's missing off the slide, which is what the GDP of Poland is and what the GDP of the EU3 is. And I think a really good first step to the story could be actually sizing the opportunity and then making a recommendation on which segment you should target first. Let's do one more. Let's skip this text-heavy slide. So let's say, okay, we've identified that these are the 5 key trends here that are taking place in the Polish market. And let's identify what the insight or the assertion is from this slide. And I'll pop another 90 seconds here on the clock. And we can draft a tagline for this slide. All right, that's 90 seconds. Go ahead and hit enter. Take a second just to read through these. Yeah, I like the themes I'm seeing across many of these. We're doing the math in terms of how much is the 65 and over share of the population increasing by in the next 20 years, and then what's the implication of that? A, we should enter Poland, and B, we should enter with a product that's tailored to that segment of the population. So I like the themes that I'm seeing across all of these taglines of number one, doing the math for me, and then number two, drawing the implication out of the math that you've just done. Wonderful. We've got about 5 minutes left here. And so I wanted to open up the floor, A, for questions, either generally speaking about presentations, taglines, et cetera, or B, if someone had a specific question about work that they're doing right now and would like help applying this to slides that you're creating right now. So whether you have general questions or would like help with something specific, we'll open up this last 5 or 6 minutes here to help however we can. So I will just open up the floor and you're able to unmute yourself and jump in if there's anything you'd like us to speak to. All right, I'm seeing some things coming through the chat. So Michael says, is there any suggested different methodology for presenting to clients versus internal stakeholders? Michael, the short answer from me is no. I think there is some nuance, though, that comes in when you're presenting to internal stakeholders versus external. I think that the context that you share up front is much more critical in a client setting. So the SCQ that Jenny Ray mentioned at the beginning of our call today, here's where we're coming from. Here, we heard what you told us last time. And so we've come back now with, an assertion, a hypothesis based on what you told us was important to you. I think within a trust building and relationship building context that we often find ourselves in with our clients, that SCQ can be incredibly powerful to frame external conversations. And I think we can sometimes with internal stakeholders, depending on how much trust we have with them and how closely we work with them, we can short circuit some of that context building and get right into the meat of our story, which is, here's why I've asked for 30 minutes of your time today. Here's what I'm going to recommend that we do. And here are the 2 to 3 reasons why. And we can just jump right in. But I think ultimately, whether we're communicating with internal or external stakeholders, our goals are, I want to gain your buy-in and I want to motivate action from you. And so at a high level, I think our goals are the same. And so our methodology can be the same as well. There's just some nuances that come into play with the relationship management and building that I would be paying attention to. We've got time for 1 or 2 more questions if someone wants to pop something in the chat or unmute yourself. Okay, Mohammed, give me a second here just to read this. So the crux of your question is, how can I use pyramid principle to address my line manager who wants to know that I did the work? Amazing.
Such a good question.
Yeah, great question. So put a story together that follows the framework we've talked about today and verbalize and say, here's all the work that I did a lot of work to put this story together, and I'm coming to you with what I think are the most important things for us to pay attention to today and the most important drivers of the decision that we have to make. I am more than happy to share my appendix with you after this call to show you all the work that I did. I'm more than happy to share my data repository. I'm more than happy to share my model. And I would encourage you to, ahead of your meeting with your line manager, say, here's the way that I'm thinking about structuring our next meeting. I'm going to walk you through the most important things that I found first, and then I'm happy to share all the rest of the work that I did afterwards. I think that will lead to a more efficient and effective meeting. What do you think about that? And if your manager says yes, then walk them through a more curated version of your story and share all of the data with them afterwards offline. That would be the approach, Mohammed, that I would recommend in terms of how to apply pyramid principle to your context. And then if your stakeholder says, you know what, I like the way that we've been doing things, then do what your stakeholder asks for. But I think that this is a way that you can be a little bit more assertive and try to drive more action from the meetings that you're having with them. We are at time. So Jenny Ray, I'll give you one last chance to share any kind of summary or recap that you'd like to share before we drop today.
No, I just really want to say thank you to everybody for joining. I think Namaan did a great job leading us through a lot of the material. We would love to help you with your presentations. We know a lot of that can be done better offline and in a private setting. And so I've just popped back into the chat the meeting, scheduling. If you also want help for your whole team, you can book through that same meeting. Just go through the Power Presentations link, and we can have a setup for that. But anything that you find that's helpful, we always like to know about it. Anything that you want more of, that you think we could do better, please feel free to leave that in the chat before you drop off. And we hope that you have a great week. We'll see you next month for how to not suck at emails. It's not quite worded like that, but it's basically, it has the word suck in it, right, Namaan?
Something like that.
Wonderful. If you registered for the call, we'll send out the recording afterwards. So we're looking forward to doing that for everybody. Thanks again. Appreciate having you and look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks, everyone.